Okay, kid, listen. I'm coming in, okay?
No, don't.
Exactly what the hell is the situation? What, did you shit yourself or something?
Oh, I wish.
No. Jenn said I have too much fixing in my cube.
Listen, it's not the end of the world. These kind of things happen. Let's have a look at it. No, for God-never sake! Shh! Sheila!
No!
Sheila,
No,
honey?
don't.
Sheila, honey, you gotta come here. You gotta see this.
What? No!
Don't come in here, honey.
Don't!
Don't worry. She's a dental hygienist. She'll know exactly what to do.
Hi, Ted.
Hi, Mrs. Jensen. How are you?
You okay?
Yeah.
Holy shit! Shh. Charlie, you could have warned me. Keep it down. Okay,
I'm sorry, Mrs. Jensen. I just don't want her. I don't want her here, you know?
Let's just relax here, okay?
No, you know what? I don't need any. Really.
Oh, there.
Oh, Christ.
What the hell's going on here? Neighbors said they heard a lady scream.
Well, you're looking at him. You gotta take a look at this thing.
Just.
Oh, Jesus. What the hell were you thinking?
I don't know. It wasn't like it was a well thought out plan.
Somebody's gonna have to move that station wagon in front so I can get the truck in here.
Lenny, come here.
Oh.
Take a look at what this numbnuts did.
Holy shit! Mike, Eddie, get down here quick. Bring everybody. Bring a camera. You're not gonna believe this. We got a kid down here.
He's got over 80 fixing lands in his 360 card cube. You won't believe it. Hi, everybody, and welcome to another episode of Lucky Paper Radio. My name is Andy, and I'm here, as always, with my co-host, Anthony, tasked with roasting me on behalf of our listeners, Maddox.
And I'm here with Andy, Triome Hater Mangold.
Okay, do you know...
Is that good?
But do you know why me being a Triome hater is important right now, in this moment, in space and time?
I have a vague idea.
What is the vague idea?
Is it that we're joined by Jenn the Judge?
Okay, well, hold on. No, it's not that. Stop. You're messing it all up.
Shoot.
Anthony, I put a full cycle of Triomes in the 100 Ornithopters Cube.
Really?
Yeah.
Did I already know this? Did I draft them? I don't think so.
No.
I don't think I've seen them.
This was a secret that I alluded to
Oh
Cube
my
nights ago
God.
that I didn't want you to tell because I wanted to tell you on the
put
podcast.
Triomes in a cube?
Now you're hamming it up.
What are you
even though
thinking?
you don't actually care. Yeah, I'm a notorious
What, you put
Triome.
some life gain in there, too?
It's got a fair bit
Did
of
you
life gain in
Did you
there.
put a Angel Fire Ignition in there?
That's been in there.
I
That's
know.
your favorite
I know
card
that
to
one.
draft. I'm a notorious Triome detractor, and yet I do think it was right for the 100 Ornithopters Cube, which is related to our broader subject, as Anthony insinuated, trying to steal my introduction. We are joined by a guest on this episode of Lucky Paper Radio. It's the they-them managing the mayhem at F&M, Jenn the Judge. Welcome, Jenn.
Love that introduction. I'm going to steal that. That's mine now.
You can have it. It's a gift.
Great. Wonderful. So I'm here to tell you that the Triomes in the Ornithopter Cube is cringe, I'm sad to say.
Oh, no. It's just what I suspected.
Jenn is much better at roasting than me, apparently.
Yeah, seriously. They really outdid you immediately.
Well, I live in New York. It comes with the territory.
Yeah, you got to be good at roasting there. Otherwise, you won't survive on the mean streets of New York City.
So I am here to tell everyone the very controversial truth that is your fixing in your cube is too good.
All right, this is great. I'm so excited to have you here for this because I feel like I have spent a long time telling people that fixing their cube is not good enough. And so we get to have both arguments here. Our listeners can then evaluate them and then use them to whatever design goals they have. And I'm honestly genuinely very glad because, obviously this is 230 of some episodes of this podcast. So my opinion is well documented and I'm much more interested in hearing your take on the fixing density in cubes. And I think more broadly, just 5-color good stuff in general, because believe it or not, we've recorded so many episodes of this godforsaken podcast, and we did cover 5-color good stuff, Anthony, in episode 5.
Wow.
That was the last time we talked about this subject by name, which is kind of shocking because it is a big deal, I think, to a lot of cube designers. So Yeah, where do you want to start, Jen? Lead the way.
So I would love to start in what is many people's favorite Magic the Gathering setting, Ravnica. It is my favorite Magic the Gathering setting. It's where I started playing back in 2005 for Christmas. I got a box of, I believe it was Dissension, and I was immediately cooked. It was over for me. I was going to be a Magic addict for the rest of my life.
That's a beautiful story.
But the downside of Ravnica, despite it being thematically a set about color pairs and the guilds, is most of the limited formats end up being how many colors can I physically play in this deck to play all the good cards. Usually that is off the back of the mana-producing artifacts and also the density of fixing lands in those packs.
This is actually a format I don't think Anthony nor I have ever played. Have you played any actual Ravnica Limited, Anthony?
Nope, this is before my time
Yeah,
as a
so
limited player.
Is this one of the sets, Jen, where they seeded a fixing land into every pack? Was this the era in which they were doing that, or were they just a common? How did fixing work in Ravnica Limited?
Oh, an OG Ravnica Limited? That's a great question. I was 7 at the time and do not remember. A lot of more modern Ravnica sets have seeded fixing lands. Generally, they're the Guild Gates. Those are kind of the most famous ones. And then you can also get shocks. Sometimes there are a lot of colorless utility lands in Ravnica. Ravnica Limited has always had very good fixing and very strong utility options. Guild Gates are, of course, the most famous. A lot of cubes will have gates as a sub-theme, especially after it was boosted by Baldur's Gate. But the format in general is very soupy and not really the guild-specific pairings that I think the set is intended to represent.
That's interesting to hear. I've only drafted the Return to Ravnica, and my experience of that set was it was very much leaning into those 2-color pairs. I remember especially in our local meta, the Boros decks were really taking over. Do you think that was maybe just our local playstyle? People were just gravitating to kind of what the cards were telling you to do? Or do you think there was a difference in the design from the previous iteration of a Ravnica set?
Is Return to Ravnica Remastered or War of the Spark?
Neither.
The one
Ravnica
right before
Allegiance
War of the
and
Spark.
Guilds of Ravnica.
Oh my god, Ravnica Allegiance. Ravnica Allegiance is a great draft set. Ravnica Allegiance actually did a better job than most Ravnica sets being balanced. And one of the ways it did that was the uncommon cycle that was Sunder Shaman, Sphinx of New Prov, all of those cards.
The XXYY gold cards.
Yes, those cards are both incredibly powerful and make greedy mana bases terrible. Like, those cards, if you resolve them on 4, are game warping, but if it takes you until like turn 7 to get all the pips online, they're not as good. They're answerable. And those did a much better job than anything else Ravnica has tried at kind of forcing you into actual 2-color play a lot of the time.
Now, I don't want to take as a given that everyone listening will understand maybe why the idea of just jamming as many colors in your Ravnica deck is not desirable or, maybe not fun. Can you speak to maybe the downsides of this kind of deck where you just get to take as much fixing as you want and put as many colors as you can into your limited deck?
So in regular limited, not talking about Cube yet, the biggest downside is it removes a lot of interesting drafting decisions. If you're playing a 2-color set, like most draft sets are, you have to weigh, like, say it's pack 2, I opened a rare, it's not in the colors that I'm currently drafting. You can consider pivoting, you can consider splashing, you can look at what fixing in this set looks like that would warrant a splash versus what you've already drafted that might warrant a pivot. If fixing is too good, you just take it and then pick fixing lands and you're not punished and there's no interesting decision. Other than that, drafting fixing correctly is something that new players especially are just not very good at. Most players, when they start playing, they don't want to play lands that smooth over their play style. They want to play the big dumb idiots that do big dumb idiot things.
Yeah, why take a land out of this pack? That won't kill my opponent.
Yeah, I could play the 6-mana 6/6 with Trample.
Anthony's eyes just
You're
lit up.
speaking my language.
But other than that, in Cube specifically, I think this is heavily expanded upon, of just players who are new to a specific cube, or even more so new to Cube in general, often don't understand how good fixing is in different environments. Like, if you start playing Vintage Cube on Midgo, fixing is so good in most decks that you often take it over what is in a different environment, like, must pick cards because the fixing allows you to play all the broken stuff.
Yeah. I feel like whenever I draft a cube, I almost like always rate fixing kind of relatively to the same degree, which is to say that I think the best fixing in any cube is usually for me like between 80 and 90% of the best cards in the cube, right? There's like 10% of the cards, 15% of the cards that are good enough to take over fixing. Then it's like all the good fixing is in a big block, and then beyond that, it's like all the rest of the cube. And if that means we're in the Magic Online Vintage Cube, then yeah, I mean the top 30, 40 cards, like the power and, you know, most appealing cards across the entire cube, I'll take over fixing. But then, you know, there's still hundreds of cards that are among Magic's most powerful cards end up in that cube that I'm taking well after a fetch land or a, you know, good duel.
Yeah, a lot of packs in Vintage Cube is like, oh, there's a fetch, I take the fetch.
Right. For me, that's even true down to like Pauper Cube, right? Like I think there's really a set of really strong cards in the average Pauper Cube that I will take over a fixing land, but after that, I'm still taking fixing above 80 or 90% of the cube most of the time, and then filling out my deck as the draft goes along. At least that's kind of how I've landed after playing as many cubes as I've played, is that like it's always kind of never the best thing to do. Like, I feel like in every cube, there's always going to be cards that are enough better than fixing that it's worth taking them pack one, pick one over a fixing land. But it's always just under the best thing to be taking really early is the best fixing in the environment. At least is my take. Is that how you feel too, Anthony?
I think so. I might be a little bit more or maybe not conservative, but the way I approach drafting, I might be less willing to take fixing before I kind of have a sense of what colors I'm in. But I would not be surprised if that is just not the optimal way to be drafting.
And then I think the other thing to talk about here with regards to cube design is that a lot of cube designers don't like the 5-color good stuff deck because I think a lot of cube designers have a vision for what they want their cube to be. They've imagined the archetypes are, you know, set up in a certain way and certain color pairs do certain things and this card is meant for this deck. And then somebody comes along and just takes all the fixing lands, all the gold cards they wield, and starts combining cards in ways that the designer didn't anticipate, doesn't even necessarily like, and kind of, I don't know, makes a mockery of all the like design, quote unquote, that's gone into the cube. At least that's what I hear from a lot of people that don't enjoy 5-color good stuff decks being viable in their cubes.
Yeah, that is an incredibly a sore spot for a lot of designers because yeah, as you said exactly, like it invalidates a lot of the design principles. If your fixing is too good and 5-color good stuff is a viable archetype, then all the design and intricate interweaving you did with different cards and different colors and like interesting splash decisions is just, oh, pick the best card in the pack. If there's no fixing, if there is fixing, pick the fixing.
Right. I should say, I don't think this is all cube designers. I do think there are cube designers out there that intentionally want the identities of color pairs or color combinations to be a little more muted and want to encourage their players to combine cards from lots of different sections of the cube in different ways. And I mean, ultimately, this is why I decided to put Triomes in the 100 Ornithopters cube. We'll get to how I feel about density of fixing and whatnot, but I did replace what was previously Pain Lands, a full cycle of Pain Lands, with a full cycle of Triomes. And I don't think anybody listening would disagree that that is a massive upgrade to the quality of the mana base.
Especially considering there are fetch lands in that cube, right?
There are fetch lands in that cube, so just made every single deck much more easily able to splash a third or fourth color, just upgraded the mana base across the board for everybody. And the reason I ultimately decided to do that there, despite kind of really strongly disliking Triomes in the vast majority of cubes I've played them in, is because there, I don't really think a 5-color good stuff deck exists in the same way that it exists in a regular cube, because first of all your deck can't be full of good stuff because it's going to have 10 to 15 of the dinkiest creature in all of Magic's history in it. Like, it's going to have 10 to 15 awful cards in the form of Ornithopter in your deck.
Wow, burn on Ornithopters.
Well, and B, everything is so synergistic that you can't just like take the best card in a vacuum out of every pack and then end up with a really functional deck at the end. I think most people that are going to be splashing into a third or fourth color are going to be doing so for more interesting combos and synergies that are the thing I do want to encourage in that cube, because you're not winning on the back of just curving out with, you know, broken Planeswalker after broken Planeswalker as you might in the Legacy Cube or the Vintage Cube. There you have to like put stuff together and build some kind of engine. And so I'm much more amenable to people having access to a better mana fixing and being able to combine stuff from different colors more freely, because I think it's going to result in creative deck building instead of the opposite, which is kind of just take the broken cards and the fixing, and doesn't really matter what order you draw them in or how they combine with each other. They're just always going to work.
That's also a good point for cubes like that are unusual enough, like ornithopters, especially because all of your creatures are colorless. Fixing is less impactful, just intrinsically.
Yeah, the fixing is funny in that cube. I have seen monocolored decks perform really well, and you can understand why that makes sense, because if you don't have an on-color card to take, you can always just take an ornithopter, right? So you can very easily commit your entire draft to just one color. And on the flip side, I've also seen 4 and 5 color decks perform really well, because you have all those colorless creatures. So even if you do have 4 or 5 colors of spells in your deck, it's not going to be that many individual cards, like that many pips of those colors. So it's actually kind of easier to build a mana base that is forgiving for that splash, because if you're splashing, a few cards, then it ends up kind of being that all your colors are a splash almost. It's a really funny environment that I'm still trying to get my head around in terms of how it works with regards to fixing. But yeah, certainly I think more extreme weird cubes are going to have more room for extreme weird mana bases. Are you also a Triome disliker in cubes, Jen?
Yes, I think that Triomes, with few exceptions, there are some cubes. My friend Amy has a multicolor cube. It was featured at CubeCon. Multicolor cube has it's a multicolor cube. It requires a great deal of incredibly powerful fixing. But for most cubes, I think Triomes simplify things too much. The existence of Triomes, especially in conjunction with fetch lands, you can just get any color way, way, way too easily. Sure, it comes in tapped. It's a little slow. But it means every fetch land can effectively fetch for every color, at least in theory, in an environment.
My biggest issue with them, I think, is especially related to the draft. It's I think a lot of cube designers see Triomes and they are drawn to the appeal of basically adding, 20 more fetchable sources of each sort of type, right? You get to put, 7 more? No. You get to put 4 more fetchable plains in your cube, 4 more fetchable islands, 4 more fetchable swamps, etc., etc. So you get to put 20 more of fetchable types. Well, I guess not 4. So there's 3 in each. How many?
Usually you do the math ahead of time.
Well, I didn't think I have to do this math. How many Triomes have a plains in them?
How many Triomes have a plains?
I believe 8, because there should be 2 pairs that don't have. There should be 2 triplets that don't have white.
6.
Right.
The answer is 6.
Okay, Anthony's actually
I've
just
discovered
typed
it
in Scryfall.
empirically. Fun fact, on Scryfall, if you search for is Triome, it'll show you the full cycle, even though half of them are not named Triome.
Sure.
Thank you, Scryfall, for patching Wizards' mistakes.
For being sensible. Okay, so what you're actually doing, if you add a full cycle of Triomes to your cube, right, is you're adding 60 more fetchable lands in a sense, right? Because you have 6 more plains, 6 more islands, because there's that many types that are in there. Woo! Could we have messed up the numbers in this section more if we had tried? I hope it's clear that what I'm trying to say here is that by adding 10 Triomes to the cube, you're effectively adding 30, not 60, 30 more fetchable types, right? Because you have 6 more of each basic land type. So when it comes to counts of how many fetchable plains you have in your cube for a deck that wants to fetch a plains, you've got 6 more. So you're getting 30 more fetchables with only 10 card slots, which is a really efficient use of space in terms of making the density of fixing better for all decks. Also, I just got Invisalign, and I'm self-conscious about how it's making me talk different. Which means that, you have a bunch of additional blue-white fetchables now without having to fill your cube with a bunch more hallowed fountains. And I think a lot of cube designers like the idea that Triomes would just be played as a sort of hybrid card. Either it's a blue-white duel or a blue-black duel or a white-black duel, right? It's not the Esper Triome. It's just going to be one of these 3 dual lands you can fetch up.
Right.
But in reality, what I found in cubes with Triomes is that even if you do as a player sit down and intend to draft the Triomes like that and say, I'm playing blue-white, I'll take this Esper Triome or I'll take this Bant Triome for my deck, you end up at the end looking at your mana base and just being like, well, actually my splash for this color is just free. And it becomes so easy to just play a 3rd or 4th color for a couple cards without having committed any picks to trying to draft a mana base like that at all. You just tried to draft the Triome as a fetchable source for your main colors, and you kind of got that totally for free.
Yeah, I mean, you say at the end. It's even much better when that happens in the middle of the draft. And it's not that hard to say, I've got 2 Triomes and 3 fetches. Now, I'm just going to do whatever I want at this point. I can just get whatever colors I want and, fill the gaps with a couple other dual lands. But it is just, they are uniquely crazy, the combination of fetches and Triomes.
Yeah, I think people maybe don't realize that any fetch land can get all but 1 Triome, can get 9 of the Triomes, right? There's always going to be one opposite triad that the fetch land can't get. but it's so easy to just, like you said, turn on basically all your colors with a couple fetch lands and a Triumph or two. That, I don't know, that's my feeling in most cubes, is that it makes drafting a 4 or 5 color mana base trivial and almost accidental, which is you just did it by accident, and then you there's no incentive to not play that 3rd or 4th color in basically every deck.
Also, conversely, like, it makes, if you have the correct Triome already, say you're in Sultai and you have the Sultai Triome, it means every single fetch land except one fixes for all of your colors immediately, and you don't have to take a single other land.
Right. As opposed to having to have gotten all 3 of your shock lands or surveil lands or whatever to actually build out that full fetchable mana base.
Yeah. When cubes support this kind of soup, I think it just becomes also harder to differentiate what kind of decks people are playing. Like, the homogeny adds a lot of sameness to playing cubes multiple times.
I think that's a great point, that if everybody's in 3 to 5 color decks with just the best cards they can see in the pack, there's still, I think, a lot of skill in evaluating a pack and deciding what the best card is, even if you can cast all of them, deciding if that best card is better than another fixing land. Like, I don't think drafting these decks is always completely on rails or like obvious, but it does mean at the end, like, how do you distinguish the wet Abzan deck from the Sultai deck with a splash of white, right? Like, they're going to be basically the same deck at the end of the day, and the identity is really going to be muted.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's easy to overstate this kind of effect of everybody just playing super soupy decks of just all 5 colors. But, I mean, in the worst case, it does feel, I think it makes a cube a little bit less replayable. Not necessarily because the games are less interesting, but there's just a lot less sort of variety and story equity to latch onto. It's like, it's really easy to remember the draft where, oh, you were doing this really distinct thing, and I was doing this really synergistic deck, and we had this really interesting matchup. Like, that is something that you want to sink your teeth into and go back to that cube experience, when it's instead just like, oh yeah, everybody just had some good cards and we played things on curve and whoever had the better curve won. That's a little harder to sort of get your head around. And I think that a card that actually really has demonstrated that effect to me in the past are some of the conspiracies like WorldKnit and Sovereign's Realm, which I don't think we need to get into the details of, but basically they just say you're playing whatever you want now, like color doesn't matter. And after being in a draft with somebody who's playing one of these cards, you really feel like, oh, you just took like all the cool payoffs I needed because you don't care about colors, and it has a pretty negative impact on the draft.
For the other 7 people, it's kind of awful to have one person just taking whatever they want out of the pack with no constraints.
So yeah, I mean, those are like, if we're talking about 10% things are feeling soupy, those are 100% soupy, and it's like, it's a totally different ball game. But yeah, once you play that and sort of see that extreme, you can get a sense of, this is not necessarily really where I want to be.
I also think it cannot be overstated how much a single less experienced drafter in a fixing heavy cube can distort a draft entirely.
Say more.
Like, if we're playing a cube that has very good fixing, say it's shock fetch dual fixing, and one player at the table is like relatively new to Magic or relatively new to Cube, them not picking fixing as highly as it deserves distorts the draft around that player. If they're not picking Triomes, if they're not picking the original duels, if they're not picking fetches in pack 1, the players to their left are going to have way too many. And then in pack 2, the players to the right are going to have way too many. And so it is that player and the people directly across from them in draft order are going to have probably a normal to slightly lower amount of fixing, and then the 2 to 4 players on either side of this player are going to have way too much. So you're going to get somebody who has 12 pieces of fixing, drafted every good card, and like 306 the cube without breaking a sweat, because their neighbor wasn't picking these very important, very influential cards in the draft, and so they just got flooded with them.
Do you think lands are unique there compared to other power outliers? Just imagining that same inexperienced drafter just not realizing what the best cards are and handing them to their opponents, even if they're not lands? Or do you think lands are unique in that regard?
I don't think they're exactly unique, but I definitely think they're the most obvious example of this, because it's definitely possible for newer players to not understand the power of individual cards within an individual card environment. But newer players are going to pick the cool-looking, expensive non-lands more frequently than they're going to pick fixing. Like, a player could not know how good, say, Wrenn and 6 is in a cube, but they probably know that Wrenn and 6 is really good in Modern. So they might be like, oh, Wrenn and 6, that card's very strong in a format that I pay attention to, I should just take it. Whereas opposed to if Wrenn and 6 is enabled by the fact that there are fetch lands and really good fetchables, they might not take the fetch land in the next pack.
So it's really just that you're saying, and I think you're right, that lands are much more likely to be overlooked as power outliers than other types of cards. Not that drafting lands less versus drafting other power outliers less is going to inherently have a bigger impact on the draft. It's just that's much more likely to happen when lands are the cards that are really good.
Because lands aren't cool.
I think you're also right.
Lands aren't cool. The hottest take we've heard yet.
I think you're also right that it's also just a much more obvious effect when you look over at somebody who's, maybe it's their first cube draft. You might be like, oh, your curve is maybe a little bit high. That's like a small thing you might notice. But then when you see, here's one player that has their stack of 16 non-basics, and then here's the next player who has, I have my one fixing land. Like, I usually play limited. This feels good, right? It just is really obvious to see at the table.
And it also feels bad for everyone else at the table. Like, you get paired into the person who has 18 non-basics in their 41 card deck, and you lose because their mana is insane, which means their card quality is insane. And you're like, well, there wasn't a ton I could do about that. There wasn't I couldn't play around them being seated next to a slightly less skilled drafter.
Now, just to maybe ask the questions I think some listeners might have, obviously, if this player spent all those picks on lands, how did they also end up getting really high card quality? You just said, all right, your card quality is really high because you have 18 non-basics in your mana base. Isn't there some sort of inherent tension in the fact that a player had to spend a bunch of picks on all these lands and also still somehow got the best cards?
Well, generally, I don't think they get the best cards. I think they get way too many of the second best cards.
Sure.
You might not have any of the S tier huge power outliers, but if every single card in your deck is A+, and you can play all of them because your fixing is good, that's going to beat decks that have one or two S-tier cards that just don't draw them that much.
Yeah, the way I've heard people describe drafting the 5-color good stuff deck in a cube is that if you imagine a regular pod of 8 players, and let's assume that most players are just drafting a color pair as you would do in retail limited, if you sit down as one of those players and just take almost every fixing land you see, and then every gold card that wheels, you end up with a pretty strong deck. I mean, a lot of cubes have 4 or 5 cards in each gold section. If there's only 7 players, not including you, that are just drafting a guild, that's at least 3 guilds that are completely untouched. You're going to get those gold cards really late. And a lot of times gold cards are some of the best cards in a cube, even if they're a combination that not every player can always put in their deck. So I do think that this sort of question that the listeners might have of how did they get all the good cards when they spent all their picks on lands? It's cubes are full of good cards, and they're opening themselves up to playing way more options of the cards they get in the second half or the middle of a pack than a player that is committing to a specific color combination early on.
Yeah, pick 15 in cube is going to be sometimes very relevant, where pick 15, or I suppose now pick 14 in retail limited is going to be almost always a basic land.
Yeah, when I have drafted this strategy, that's one of the best feelings to how you know you're doing it right, is when your last 2 picks in the pack are oh, these are great cards, I'm for sure going to main deck. That's how you know that the 5-color good stuff deck is in fact coming together.
It's paid off.
So I think you are suggesting that the density of fixing is a big factor in the prevalence or success of this deck. And I just want to ask, we go back to your example of, let's say we got a pot of 8 players, and you said the example of playing a fixing dense cube. One inexperienced player means that the players on either side of them, especially to their left, are going to get a ton of fixing. That should be true no matter what the relative density of that fixing is, right? Whether the cube has 40 fixing lands or 80 fixing lands, theoretically, the players on either side will still have relatively a lot more than every other player at the table, or is there some other detail I'm missing there?
I think it is that not all fixing is equally good. A great example of this is shocks versus duels. If you're getting duels, you're effectively get to splash a color with no punishment. But if you have to use shocks, your life total going down is often relevant. There's generally an aggressive deck in a format. Generally, somebody at the table is playing it. And if your 5-color good stuff mana base is 6 shocks, those are still fetchable even if you enter them untapped, but it gets significantly worse against that aggro deck. You have a weakness in the pot. Sure, you might not get matched into them, but if all of those shock lands are dual lands, you're not punished at all for doing this, which means your life total is 20 against the aggro deck, and you probably can stabilize with your 5-color good stuff removal.
Yeah, I think there's so many factors to the success of this deck, right? And there's a couple case studies I feel like we can reference here. One is a cube I played for the first time this past week. It was actually first drafted for the first time just 2 nights ago on Tuesday. And this cube is a Graveyard Matters cube, and the mana base is, among other sort of incidental fixing lands, it is 2 cycles of fetches, so 20 fetch lands, and then 3 cycles of surveil lands. So just tons of ways to surveil. And there's some really cool aspects of this, right? Like I think it makes cards like Dimir, Spybug, and Thoughtbound Phantasm all of a sudden like very strong and able to hang with some of the best cards in Magic's history, which is really sick. Yeah. I kind of approached this draft with I kind of think a 5-color good stuff deck is going to be very strong here, just like a hypothesis I had, because I thought it'd be hard to be aggressive if basically all the fixing in the cube was tapped. It'd be really hard to have a good, efficient, aggressive 2-color mana base. And I was like, well, I'll just take a lot of high-value things across like 3 or 4 colors and a ton of these surveil lands. And in fact, I ended up with 3 basics in my deck. I think I had 6 or 7 fetch lands and then 8 or 9 surveil lands plus a few basics. I had to play 1 more land than I wanted to just to have a basic of each type, which
exactly the 18 non-basics 41 card special.
And I was playing a Jeskai deck with splashing black. I didn't have any swamps, but I only had like 3 cards that had a single black source on them, and it was no problem at all. But my deck did not do super hot, and one of the big reasons was because yes, it's true that aggro decks didn't have a fast mana base because all their fixing was tapped, but it also meant that almost every single land in my deck was tapped. I had 3 basics, right? And then I fetches that could get them if I could time it at the right moment, but I was, getting to turn 4 and still waiting to cast a 4-drop because my 4th land came into play tapped, and I was always like really behind in the mid game, and actually turning the corner with my better cards proved really hard. So there's so many factors, right, to whether or not the 5-color deck can really work. Another example I think is really interesting is our friend has a cube called the Oldest School, in which the fixing is just 6 cycles of original duels. No fetches, no nothing else. You just get original duels. It's kind of like an alpha beta inspired format. And so there, the downside of the fixing lands is none, right? Because there is no non-basic land hate in that cube. So they're just great. They're just way better than basics. But because you have no fetch lands and you have nothing that produces more than 2 colors of mana, I found it really hard to draft decks of many colors in that cube. Have you had that same experience, Anthony?
Yeah, I actually drafted this just last week and definitely was in that space where it's like, I'm trying to get my duels early and make sure I have enough for my main colors. And then because they are free, I still ended up playing a couple off-color duels just for 1 random kicker card that had an off-color kicker. But it does feel much more difficult than, the most extreme case of I have a bunch of fetches and triomes.
It really highlights how much fetch lands are really strong, right? Because if you imagine just imagine in your head trying to build a mana base, listener, of like 3 strong colors with just dual lands, and it's like, well, okay, you could have like 6 of each source and then overlap them a little bit, but you're still going to have kind of a shaky mana base compared to just having a couple fetch lands and a triome, or a couple fetch lands and a fetchable of each of your color combinations. Just a quick note, there's one other detail about this cube that I think limits the viability of 5-color decks, and that is the very few number of gold cards. At time of recording, there are 16 gold cards in this cube. I think there have been even fewer in the past. So even if you do manage to get a ton of dual lands, the payoff is often not there, because you're way more likely to wheel gold cards that are really strong, because some drafter has to be in exactly both of those colors to take it, versus wheeling a monocolored card that's really strong, because there's basically guaranteed to be other drafters that are in every color at the table. Anyway, I'm blabbering now, but to me it feels like there's definitely... I've always felt like the success of a given deck, like a 5-color deck in a given format, is always a factor of like everything. All the cards in the cube, right? The density and nature of the fixing lands, the speed of the aggro decks, the payoffs for being 5 colors, right? Like, are the gold cards you wheel actually generically strong, or are they all super synergistic and they might not work together with each other? That's a much harder idea to convey to a budding cube designer. Like, hey, every decision is all interconnected and it all impacts the viability of this deck.
That's a really good way to introduce somebody to cube design. Like, welcome to this cool new thing. Everything is connected.
Everything is everything.
Concretely.
And no, I can't give you a simple answer to how many fixing lands you should put in your cube, or whether or not it's going to make 5-color good stuff decks better or worse, because it depends on all the things.
Yeah, I mean, I think that is a really, really big part of it, is just, is there both a power level delta that's big enough to make actually, having access to more cards of your choice better? Because, imagine the power level is totally flat. Having find cards in a two-color deck is going to be just as good as a five-color deck that's able to take advantage of the best cards in more colors. And then, yeah, I think that strong gold cards really go a long way, because if you have strong monocolored cards, then you potentially have 3 players at a table in a normal cube that are potentially interested in a strong monocolored card, whereas much, much fewer in those gold cards.
And I love what Jen said about the XXYY uncommon cycle from Ravnica Allegiance, because I think that's a great example of, like, those were some of the best uncommons in that format, and Retail Limited is largely dictated by the strength of your sort of best cards, and so it was a really strong motivation to be able to cast them on curve. Jen, actually, my favorite Ravnica format I've ever played is actually your Ravnica Cube, which I drafted at Cube for a Cause in Brooklyn. It was my favorite draft of the whole weekend, and
awesome.
The decks in that draft, I think, were very much themed based on the combo they were drafting. There were some 3-color decks, mostly 2-color decks, but they were definitely not soupy. How did you achieve the goal of keeping players confined to, 2 colors, maybe 2 colors and a splash in your Ravnica Cube?
When I started building my Ravnica Cube, the first thing I did was I played a lot of other Ravnica Cubes. I played a lot of Ravnica Limited, and most importantly, I took a long look at what Ravnica Remastered looked like. Because Ravnica Remastered is, all the remastered sets is like, WotC is saying, like, here's the set cube for this set. These are all the cards we think are cool. We did our best to weave everything together. They're always very fun. But Ravnica Remastered was one of the soupiest formats I have played in my life. One of my locals said something that I thought was very funny. On the very first Ravnica Remastered draft we ran, he showed up and he said, the only question I asked myself going into this, preparing, was, am I playing 4 colors or 5? Which I think is not the question you should be asking in a Ravnica setting. A lot of that was because the fixing in that set was A, plentiful, and B, colorless. Because the signets existed in that set, and because the signets are so good, there was no reason to play less than 4 colors. The aggressive decks, because, well, embarrassingly, a lot of OG Ravnica cards are really bad and unplayable. The aggressive decks are not actually very fast. The fixing is incredibly, incredibly, incredibly strong, and signets were most of that. They're 2 mana, they accelerate you, and they fix for colors.
I've heard people make the argument about, like, the Magic Online Vintage Cube that the signets are toxic for this exact reason. They just let you splash cards and, like, basically play 5 colors with no cost, because that's the other thing about these, like, greedier decks, is that not only are they playing cards of all colors, but I think you often end up playing cards that are further up the curve, because you are less concerned about, like, curving out and more concerned about just playing the most powerful cards. And obviously the more mana a card costs, the more raw power it's going to have. And so if you also get to put fixing your deck that is also acceleration, and the signets are especially egregious in that you can go from having neither a red nor a green source to having both and just turning your off-color sources into exactly what you need. Yeah, I think that's a great example of, like, not even lands at all, but they can have a much bigger impact on whether or not these kind of greedy decks are viable.
Yeah, like I draw my opening 7, it's 2 planes and a Gruul Signet. Great, I have access to all 3 of my colors.
Nailed it, yeah.
That also, I think, points to another thing that is another compounding factor that can make 5-color good stuff too good, is the prevalence of colorless cards, especially cheap ones. If you have a lot of cheap colorless cards, it means that your early mana turns we don't care about the color. If you have, for that exact example, if I have 2 planes and a Gruul Signet, and my 1-drop is colorless, I have a 1-drop I can play. It doesn't actually matter, it doesn't have to be white. It makes the existence of colorless cards can smooth over that transition from my mana base is a little clunky to my mana base is online now.
Yeah, you just get to buy time playing signets or, like, a Perilous Mirror, and then eventually turn the game around with big 4 and 5 drops of any color you could dream of.
Yeah, absolutely. So for Ravnica Cube specifically, I attempted to address that by Ravnica Cube has a single colorless card in it. The only colorless card in the entire cube is Invasion of Ravnica.
Which, I mean,
that makes
you
sense.
gotta include
Flavorful.
it.
You do have to include it, I feel. At one point, there were no colorless cards, and then somebody made the very persuasive point that you kind of do have to include Invasion of Ravnica.
The very persuasive point. You have to do it. You literally have to.
You have to do it. So fixing in Ravnica Cube is pretty good. It's every color pair has the bounce land, the shock land, and the surveil land.
And you are bigger than 360 in that cube, correct?
It is exactly 360.
Exactly 360. Okay, so you are drafting every card every time with a full pod.
Yes. I plan to increase it from 360 to 480 at some point. It's just making any decision is hard when making a cube, and finding the time is hard when living in New York.
Very relatable. I mean, not the living in New York part, but everything being hard is very relatable.
No, remember, we live in soft Baltimore.
Yeah, exactly. So soft down here.
So the fixing is very strong. Bounce lands are obviously incredibly powerful, especially in the slower decks. They let you hit your land drops more consistently, and if you can afford to take a turn off, they're just pure upside. The shock lands, obviously, some of the best fixing lands ever printed, probably in third place behind fetches and OG duels. Well, actually, probably fourth place now that Triomes exist.
Yeah, I think Triomes are pretty good.
Triomes are pretty good. And then the Surveil lands, I actually think the Surveil lands were the best thing Wizards of the Coast has done for Cube in a very, very long time. The Surveil lands, I think, are exactly what fixing should be. They are inherently slow. They're still fetchable, but they do something that's shockingly relevant in a lot of cases, even when you don't actually care about the graveyard.
For sure. I love the Surveil cycle. It has been great, and I think a lot of Cube designers have come around to it being fun, powerful, like everything you want out of a good Cube card.
But other than the fixing and the lack of colorless cards, it was the inclusion of cards with a lot of pips. Pips make splashing hard. Lack of pips makes splashing easy. And when your good cards have a lot of pips, especially a lot of multicolored pips, it means that there is a very real incentive to not play super greedy mana bases. It, of course, runs the Ravnica Uncommon cycle, but it runs a lot of other heavy pip cards in the multicolor sections.
That's a huge point, and I think a great lesson that we can learn as Cube designers is that it's very easy for us to sort of be in the player mindset and think, oh, I don't want all these high pip cards, they're harder to cast, so I'm going to cut down and play as many easy to cast cards as possible. But the effect of that is actually it just dramatically changes what is optimal in the environment and potentially just leads away from the kind of gameplay you're looking for.
Yeah, there is a huge difference between cards that have 2 pips and 3 pips. Just if you delve into the math behind it, having 2 pips especially if you're looking to cast it on turn 4 or later, which often a 2-pip card is going to be, the likelihood that you have access to 2 distinct pips is very high. If you were looking for 3 specific pips, that gets more challenging, especially when fixing is limited.
Something about me as a player is that I place a lot of priority on my mana base, and probably to my detriment. I think I probably should be splashing more often than I am, should not be taking lands as highly as I do. I think I so much hate losing to my mana being bad that I'm, probably losing some equity and some win percentage by just putting too much priority on it. But I will say that for me, in my 5-color good stuff decks, if I'm in a cube that I think supports it, I don't even want a double pip card. I don't want anything with double pips. To me, it's it's all going to be gold cards that are no more than one of each color. And you've alluded to this in the podcast before, Anthony, where you're like, I don't know the math, but it just feels like it should be fine. And the idea that between all of your dual lands or tri lands or fetch lands, the idea of do you have white versus do you have a white and a blue or a white and a black or a white and a green, or I think it genuinely is easier to cast a 2 white green card than a 2 white card in the average mana base, because getting your first of each color is not that hard. And then when you start thinking about getting your second and what you're giving up to fetch that second.
For sure, especially if you have the selection of something like fetches.
Right, because if you fetch your first one, oftentimes you can use, say 2 fetch lands to pretty much get all the colors, even in your 4 or 5 color deck. But if you need to get a second white with your fetch land in order to cast your white spell, that often means you're just not getting a whole color. So you're locking out a whole set of cards from your deck of being able to cast it. So I definitely wouldn't touch any 3-colored pips in a 5-color good stuff deck, and I would say even something with 2 pips of the same color would have to be a huge bomb for me to be willing to stretch for that in my average 5-color deck.
Yeah, you've limited 5-color soup enough when you're playing the 5-color soup deck and you see a gold card and you think, I don't know if I can actually play this.
Or better yet, I think one of my greatest tools in this regard is just putting gold cards in that you don't really want to play, right? Does the 5-color soup deck want Swiftblade Vindicator? Maybe, but that card is so synergistic, so important to play on curve that it feels like it's the kind of card that even if you could cast it, does the deck that's got a bunch of random removal and 4 and 5 mana bombs, do you want a Swiftblade Vindicator? Maybe not.
Yeah, that's a very good point. This is especially, you can especially work with that in the aggressive colors or in the aggressive strategies. 5-color good stuff piles are hopefully not going to be really aggressive decks.
I think it's hard for them to be aggressive, even when you have a great mana base mathematically and you have, enough sources of all of your colors. it often just takes time to get there. You need a couple turns to get your things. It's really hard to curve a specific 1-drop into a specific 2-drop of a different color, because you can get your sources, but maybe not in the order you want them in necessarily, or, not to sequence things ideally. So, I think about putting power outliers just at like 1 mana, right? Like Ragavan is a broken card. I think we all know this, but it's also the kind of card that I wouldn't take as highly if I was in a 4 or 5 color good stuff deck, because am I going to have a red source on turn 1? Am I going to want to fetch my red source on turn 1 given the rest of the cards in my hand, or am I going to want to fetch other colors to open up more options? And then can I support a Ragavan dashed in later? I just think having power outliers that are inherently aggressive does really help in terms of limiting the effectiveness of these decks.
Yeah, and that leads into the last thing to highlight, I think, about Ravnica Cube in an attempt to prevent fixing from being too good is just limit the number of sources in your cube that can tap for every color. Ravnica Cube has exactly one, and it is Guildmage's Forum, which, if you were familiar with Guilds of Ravnica, is not very good at being fixing sources. But that is the only part, and this, I think Ravnica Cube is a very extreme example because I was focusing so much on getting people to play 2 and 2 color and 2 color with splash decks. But if you have a lot of ways to tap for all colors, especially if those enter untapped, your City of Brass, your Mana Confluences, that sort of stuff, that does a lot to support 5 color good stuff piles. That can remove the effectiveness of having cards with a lot of pips because your fixing is perfect. Though, to their credit, they do have the benefit of all of them have downsides. Either they cost some mana to put into play, they have some other additional costs to get into play, or they hurt you every time you use them.
Yeah, I'll also say that we in Baltimore have a lot of cubes that break singleton for lands. It's like a thing that just is very popular here. And oftentimes that is for some combination of fetch lands and fetchable lands. And specifically in a 4 or 5 color mana base that is largely built on fetches and fetchables, I don't actually rate a land like Mana Confluence that highly because it doesn't fit into any of those arrays, right? Like, it's not going to be fetchable ever. And so if I'm trying to get enough fetchable sources and really minimize the number of basics I'm playing, I often kind of see that as hopefully I don't need that, right? Like, my ideal mana base wouldn't include a Mana Confluence or a City of Brass. It would just be entirely built on these fetches and fetchables. But I definitely agree in other environments, those lands are huge factors, and they're especially good at splashing. If you have just 1 pip of a color here or there, they're great sources for that without having to commit to what that color is in the draft, right? Just knowing that this is going to always tap for my splash color, whatever that is quite powerful.
I also think the existence of 5 color good stuff also makes the color balance a little bit harder to pull off, because a lot of 5 color good stuff decks are going to want to be base green, because green has access to so much mana tutoring. A lot of green creatures tap for all colors. That's kind of part of that's one thing green is historically very good at, and it is included in a lot of cubes. And if 5 color good stuff is good in your cube, you generally are going to want to put more green cards in than everyone else, because everyone's going to want to be playing green. For the same reason, Vintage Cube has more blue cards than everyone else, because all of the best cards are blue, so more players than average are going to be playing blue.
I'm curious what your opinion is, Jen, on the sort of self-balancing of this. Something we talk about a lot is that cube design is great because draft is inherently somewhat self-balancing. If you design a cube where, one color is just way better than another color, or, some certain color combo is just really strong, after a draft or two, the players should pretty much pick up on that, and then it becomes much harder to draft the broken black-red deck because there are a few players that know it's good and they're highly picking cards for that deck. Do you think a similar pattern happens with 5 color good stuff? And what happens if there's a pod where 3 to 4 players all agree that 5 color good stuff is what they want to be doing? Can they still pull that strategy off?
It definitely is self-balancing in some way. If 4 players at the table are going for 5 color good stuff, I have bad news for all of them. They're not going to have a 5 color good deck.
We call that 5 color medium stuff,
which is maybe good news for the cube designer. I honestly delight a lot when somebody drafts a 4 or 5 color deck in my cube and then just totally bombs. it's I get a lot of Schadenfreude. I'm like, yeah, okay, I'm glad you thought you could do that, but turns out you can't.
But I think that also, that is very self-balancing. That also, I don't think feels particularly good as a play thing. If it takes a couple drafts to learn that fixing is good, it means that your first couple drafts are going to feel kind of bad. You're going to be playing a 2-color deck, and then you're going to get rolled over by a 4-color deck with really good fixing. It also means like some of those players who play and get demolished in a cube are not going to want to play cube again, which
Right.
Sucks for them and sucks for everybody. It also, like, if 5-color soup is good, 3 players at the table are playing it, 2 of them kind of pull it off, and 1 of them bricks their draft, that player's going to have a bad time. Their deck doesn't do anything. They're going to have a lot of games where they don't have the right color. It's going to feel very frustrating for them. I think part of the argument against 5-color good stuff is it helps your cube be more egalitarian to people who are not intimately familiar with the environment. Like, if you and the same 7 people play a cube every single week, and 5-color good stuff is a good deck in that thing, more often than not, people are going to read the signals correctly, and they're going to realize, I'm not sitting in the 5-color seat, somebody else is. They might even, depending on the signals that they're reading, they might even know who the 5-color drafter is within a player or two. But for newcomers to your cube group, for people playing it for the first time, especially for people who are new to cube, that's going to feel kind of bad if the environment is unassailable in that way. Of there's like you need this background to understand the draft process well. There's always going to be a learning curve, but I think having soup as a supported archetype makes that learning curve like extra hard, and it can feel extra bad. Bricking a draft feels terrible for even people who are experienced cube players.
Definitely. I think that's something really good to keep in mind, sort of as a cube designer, to think about who your players are. And if you are playing with a group that has mixed experience levels, then having it be really easy to sort of get away with these 5-color soup decks means a new player might come in, see a clear signpost that they draft around and think like, okay, I've got this sweet deck built around this theme, and then not only lose, but lose in a way that they're like, what just happened? Like, I clearly tried to do the theme, and you just kind of like messed around with a bunch of cards that were all better than mine, and that can be a really unsatisfying experience. So yeah, I think especially if you have sort of a mixed group, making sure that kind of experience doesn't happen can go a long way.
It's often an invisible strategy in the sense that looking at a pack, looking at gold cards, looking at sort of the mechanics on the cards, you can often derive what the designer wants you to be doing in a given seat. And so even an inexperienced drafter or someone who doesn't know the cube that well can figure that much out. Like, oh, it seems like blue-white is meant to be controlling and red-white is meant to be aggressive. But unless you're including, 5-color payoffs, which is kind of a whole other question, right? Like whether you put Niv Mizzet or Golos in your cube or whatever. Unless you're including those, oftentimes this 5-color deck doesn't have any signposts. Like, you have to just know. It's like a secret language. And I think those particular decks can feel a lot worse. It just comes back to our point that everything is connected to everything else. Like, if you are planning to draft your cube with a lot of new players, you're trying to grow your play group, you're showing up at random game stores or, events and firing with strangers, then I think this is a lot more important to consider. If you're listening and you have a very regular play group of you and your buddies, you get together every week and draft your cube, and it's always the same meta, then I think you can rely a lot more on self-balancing aspects to help even things out a little bit and give yourself a little more leeway there. But that's why it's all connected.
Building a cube is a puzzle, and having 5-color good stuff be an archetype means that you're trying to solve that puzzle drunk.
I mean, should we apologize a little bit for the 5-color deck? Because I think that what you're alluding to, Andy, is that you can also deliberately make 5-color its own kind of strategy, whether it's based on kind of this invisible accumulation of different effects or these really explicit payoffs like something like Niv Mizzet. Or it also can just be something that some players really, really enjoy. Some players will love to open up a pack and say, like, I see what you're trying to do here, and I want to just turn sideways and drive across your railroad tracks and do my own thing. And it is kind of like, it's a different puzzle, but for some players also a satisfying one.
This is actually something I really wanted to talk about with regards to 5-color good stuff, because I developed a more nuanced opinion towards it when I was working feverishly on my old border cube, the neoclassical cube. And there, I found that cards, just generally speaking, were just obviously, there were more downsides on cards. Even good cards did less. They were sort of less all-encompassing. There were less Lunchables where they were self-contained and had all the components necessary.
You had to draft your ham and your cheese separate.
You had to get them all separate. Anyway, I found that I was, as a player and a designer, much less upset when a player did draft a really ambitious mana base and combined cards, because every time they were doing it, it was like, oh, this is actually kind of interesting. Like, you actually managed to figure out a way to combine Pernicious Deed with, Goblin Trenches and, like, do something interesting. Like, that's actually kind of a cool synergy, and like these cards don't just each individually say win the game on your own. And I think a lot of the modern sensibility, the modern sort of distaste for 5-color good stuff is because in so many cubes, the gold cards just are, any one of them could just win the game on its own if you just like left it to its own devices. So what you're doing by drafting 5-color good stuff deck is not saying, I'm going to like play archaeologist here and uncover these interesting synergies between these gold cards that otherwise never get to get played in the same decks together. You're instead just saying, well, I'm going to take fixing lands and bombs that are self-contained and win the game on their own from a bunch of different colors, and they're interchangeable. It doesn't matter which one I play. I can play Oko, I can play Pable Mirror Breaker, I could play whatever. It's just going to win the game on its own, and it doesn't really matter. Which I think is an interesting point to consider when thinking about if you as a designer want there to be a 5-color good stuff deck in your cube, and this is where those 5-color payoffs really bug me personally, right? Like, there's some of my least favorite cards to see in a cube pack is like the 5-color Niv Mizzet Reborn, or 4-color Omnath is another example where it's like, not only are you going to like reward players for just taking fixing and gold cards, but you're going to reward them with cards that literally no other player could possibly have. Forget whether somebody's even in that guild, forget how good of it is, you will just wheel that Niv Mizzet or that Omnath if you're the only person drafting the sort of 4 or 5 color deck, and then you just get, on top of everything else, on top of having selection from all of the cards in the entire cube, you also just get this cherry on top of this huge bomb that is only for you. That's a particular design choice that I never like seeing in a cube personally. I'm like, okay, well, this deck is just a thing you want someone to draft every single time this cube is put together, and not something that's like me as a player getting to interestingly combine cards in fun ways. It's just telling me to ignore everything and just take fixing lands and gold cards.
I mean, have you ever done that? Have you ever just drafted
Yes.
Pack One, Pick One, Niv Mizzet? And just
I
been
have.
Like, here we go.
I did not have fun. I'll be honest.
Okay.
Yeah, I actually, contrary to maybe everything else that I've said this entire episode, I do think supporting 5-color good stuff with incredibly pip-heavy cards like the Niv Mizzets, I actually think is generally fine. Because there is a big difference between getting access to like 3 or 4 colors very regularly and having all 5 colors on turn 5. Being able to resolve Niv Mizzet Reborn on turn 5, even in a deck with very good fixing, is absurdly hard. But like Niv Mizzet on turn 10 is still pretty good. If you get access to your 5th color finally on turn 10, you play Niv Mizzet, you draw 3 cards, you play a gigantic flying dude. You drew a bunch of cards. That's a very strong effect. But it felt like you had to work for that. Whereas opposed to, like, I got to play my green card in my 5-color deck because I had one of Bayou that I played on turn 1. Like, that feels like you didn't work nearly as hard for it. And that, I think, is a more enjoyable play pattern to both play and play against. Like, if the payoff for their absurd mana base is they get to play a really huge, splashy, hard-to-cast guy, that feels less bad than, oh, every single one of my opponent's cards is 10% better than every one of my cards, and therefore I lost. I just got grinded out slowly over the course of the game.
Yeah, or at least, I'm on the other side of the table. I just want to be like, oh, cool. No one's ever done Pernicious Deed Goblin Trenches as far as I'm aware, and it's just really interesting to see how those cards might work together, as opposed to, just gold banger after gold banger, which to me, I really do think that's a big factor of that. It's just the way that card designs have changed over the years, and contemporary gold cards just, there's a ton of upside and usually very little downside, or usually asking very little of you in terms of a build rounding.
Yeah, absolutely. I agree completely.
All right, I want to just kind of go around the horn and maybe give our last word here. I'll give you the last thing to say, Jen, for sure. Anthony, given this conversation, and also I should say, episode 5, we talked about 5-color good stuff because we were right on the back of Jay trouncing everybody in the regular queue with 5-color good stuff.
I remember that draft.
Yeah. How do you feel about this archetype now in regards to your own cube designs?
I mean, I think that explicitly we're kind of saying, well, I mean, I'm waffling over if I even want to call it an archetype, but I guess it is. It's like it's a strategy. It's a style of deck. There is this platonic metaphysical thing that we're trying to, I don't know where I'm going with this. I think I feel in a similar place to that I did probably around episode 5, where it's like a thing that I generally don't want to happen. I don't want people just to be drafting fixing lands and playing all the best cards regardless of color that don't interact with each other, because for me, the fun of drafting is figuring out how to put those pieces together and do something interesting. However, I think 2 mitigating factors are sometimes putting those pieces together can be interesting. And I think it is probably much more, like you're saying, about the individual card choices, both in terms of like the pips and how much they ask you to build around them in order to make them good, that really impacts what the sort of feel of drafting lots of colors is. And I've had plenty of drafts that are lots of colors that just give me that satisfying draft experience. I also, just having played a lot more cubes in the intervening years and designed a lot of cubes, worry less about it, just because I think I've gotten better at identifying those kinds of individual cards that kind of drive that type of pattern, and I've just seen some success, especially with the regular cube, where 2-color decks are just kind of the way to go, or 2-color and a splash, and I feel like I have a good handle on that now.
Yeah, for me, I definitely think that my opinion of it is always very context specific. So in the old border cube, for example, my neoclassical cube, I really don't worry about it there at all. And I'm just kind of delighted if somebody manages to combine these weird old cards that usually ask a lot of you or have downsides. If you manage to draft a 4 or 5 color deck and combine cards in weird ways, people are not generally upset about that as a player, and nor am I as a designer. So there, I don't really think about it at all. And I actually think it's probably just inherently kind of bad because there's just not as many power outliers that are self-contained, so it's just hard to make that work in the first place. In the Bun Magic Cube, it's something I don't like, but that's a cube where I think I run 85 lands out of 360 cards, something around there, most of which are fixing lands, including 2 cycles of fetch lands and 3 cycles of shock lands and a couple surveil lands and creature lands. And there I have found that the fetch triple shock mana base has, in combination with a bunch of really aggressive strategies, has very successfully kept the 5-color decks in line, even though I run so much fixing. So I like to have a ton of fixing there to support my other goals of just people having good mana bases, lots of fetch lands for shuffle effects to make cards like Brainstorm better, make Delve cards better. There's a lot of reasons I like the mana base in that cube for that reason. But the 5-color issue is kept entirely in line by other aspects, mostly the fact that the shock lands cost 2 life, and I don't include things like Triomes, which would, I think, make splashes free instead of actually costing you real picks in the draft. And then I genuinely, if you had told me at the beginning of this year that I would put a full cycle of Triomes in a cube, I don't think I would have believed you, because it is so antithetical to
Didn't time-traveling Andy Mangold write you a letter?
Yeah, there is that. I was wondering if you were going to bring that up. I don't think I would have believed you that I would put a full cycle of Triomes in a cube, but the nature of the 100 Ornithopters cube, as soon as it, the thought crossed my mind and I typed it absentmindedly through the Discord, maybe I want Triomes here, it immediately was like, oh, I definitely do. It totally makes sense because that environment is inherently just ultra synergistic. And yes, you are going to have a much easier time splashing a 3rd or 4th color, but I think the outcome of that is going to be a net positive for the environment and not going to lead to the kind of brain dead drafting that I think we have sometimes been able to identify with 5-color good stuff. So in terms of how to avoid it, there's like we said, my current opinion is that everything is a factor, and you have to decide, based on your other goals, which way you want to, keep it in line if you do want to keep it in line. And I think every cube is going to have a unique answer for it depending on what your goals are.
I do want to push back on one detail just so we don't get notes from listeners.
No, you should.
I wouldn't call it brain dead drafting. I think that this is a type of drafting that Sam Black especially excels at. And I think it's because he is extremely, extremely skilled at card evaluation and knows what are the cards that fall above that line of, I want to take this over fixing. And so I think it is something that is skill demanding and nuanced, but just in a way that doesn't feel as cohesive.
Fair. The last word, Jed.
All right. So as you all have learned today, fixing is cringe, and you shouldn't put any of it in. No,
decisively.
I think the words that I would leave with people is try playing 5-color good stuff in your own cubes. Nobody's going to be better at it than you because you designed the cube yourself. And if you play it and you feel like you feel like it is too easy to draft, your deck at the end is too good, maybe consider punishing fixing in some way. Whether that be life loss through shock lands, whether that be through non-basic hate, whether that be switching out your untapped fetchables for tapped fetchables. There's a lot of levers that you can monkey with to try and dial in exactly where you want to be, where fixing is good and powerful and a part of the cube, but you can't just draft 18 non-basics and then play whatever card you want. Also, if you want to support 5-color good stuff and your play group is disciplined and good about punishing people trying to get too greedy, like that can be absolutely fine. Just keep in mind what that means to outsiders to your play group for new players coming in. Cube is Magic's most egalitarian format. Part of keeping that true is enforcing that upon ourselves by making our cubes accessible and our play groups accessible to people. And also, in the spirit of being egalitarian, lands are expensive, and cutting them from your cube makes your cube cheaper.
Oh, that is too real. I'm working on a list right now where I'm at least conscious of budget. I want to like keep it as cheap as possible for a variety of reasons, and lands are the biggest hang up on that by a big margin.
Absolutely.
Yeah. That's honestly the most compelling argument. Land's too expensive. Get him out. Get him out of here.
This episode could have been 5 minutes.
I want to just reaffirm something you just said. I think that the like drafting feature on Cube Cobra has plenty of flaws, and you shouldn't like treat it as, you know, accurate playtesting data. But the one way that I do really like to use it as a cube designer is just sit down and before you even see pack one, try to force a deck. And I think the 5-color good stuff deck is a great example. If you can reliably force excellent 5-color good stuff decks in your cube in these sort of simulated drafts on Cube Cobra, and you get to the picks 15 and 14, and you're like, these cards are great, they're going right in my main deck, that I think tells you a lot about the environment. And so I want to just support that suggestion of try drafting this deck yourself in your own cube and see how you feel about it.
Yeah, absolutely.
Jen, what should we point people to? You're on Blue Sky now. We've all migrated away from the Hell site to different website on the internet.
To slightly less Hell site.
Marginally less Hell site for now. We'll see. You know, the arc of history is long. We'll see what ends up happening. So we'll link your Blue Sky in the show notes. What else should we point people to?
I still post on Twitter. Mostly now on Twitter is just complaining about Twitter. So, you know, maybe don't follow me there because it's not particularly interesting or engaging content. Other than that, I hope to see everyone at CubeCon next year. We are looking into another exciting convention. Other than that, if you're ever in the New York area, I run the Magic program at a game store called Hexen Company, a unionized game store called Hexen Company.
Hell yeah.
We have F&M at our West Side location. We usually get about 40 to 50 people stopping in to play retail draft. If you're a limited lover and you're in the city at some point, stop by. I'm probably going to be there.
Awesome. We'll put links to all those things in the show notes so people can find you. And that's it for this episode of Lucky Paper Radio. It's got a title that Fixing is Cringe, right? That has to be the title, I think.
Oh, absolutely.
All right, all of our music is produced by DJ James Nasty. All the Magic cards are produced by Wizards of the Coast. This podcast is produced by Thinking Really Hard About Magic Cards and Speaking into Microphones About It. If we got any of the card text wrong, that was just intentional to bait you for engagement. So if you leave a comment correcting us, then you fell for it. Anthony and Jen, thank you for the gift of friendship and for the gift of Cube.
Thank you to Jen for explaining to us why fixing is cringe. It's good to know.
You're very welcome. Happy to do it anytime.